right, it looks like we're live. So, Stuart, thanks for coming on for a second time. I apologize about the technical issues on the first round. My ISP decided to do a technical update and just lost all internet for like an hour. It sucked.
Not
So,
a problem at all. I definitely lost it
oh yeah.
too. Satanic, man. The devil has.
Oh man, you're breaking up again. Shoot, we should probably do the phone. Do the phone.
Okay. All right. All good?
Yep, all good. Okay, so to start over again, Stuart, thanks for coming on. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
So I am primarily a pastor, kind of a junior apologist, if you will. I've been doing apologetics my whole life in one sense. In high school, I was part of a youth group and led an apologetics club of about 50 students. And that apologetics club was really run by more so my dad, Cliff Knechtle, who's kind of been one of the apologists more well known in 40 years. He started out doing with Billy Graham's son-in-law, and then Billy eventually even got involved in apologetics on beaches, college campuses across the country, some globally. And it's a TV show, YouTube channel. Give me an answer. So I kind of got exposed there early on, high school before with that group that came over to the house. And it really got some of my buddies who were more jocks probably actually interested in faith and spirituality. Everything else was just not working, obviously going for the question. And they saw the Mormon population and they thought the whole, magic underwear and gold tablets was kind of a joke. But so they started taking an ask, which was great, and that got me excited. But then I went through a testing period in college. My freshman year was shot me completely. But I can't because I really did a lot of soul searching and searching through other worldviews. Then I began the seminary where I got a master's in mental health and family and a master's in divinity. And then we're going to go for a doctorate in psychology. Decided I didn't want to sit in a counseling chair for 10 hours a day. So I became a pastor instead. Started working with my dad. We're both pastors at church in Connecticut and Welsh, Kansas. He just got back from 2 in Canada, and we were together earlier. I went to one at University of Delaware, and we were just at University of Texas, Texas State together, and a few others. So that's kind of what we do. And there's also a pretty big apologetics ministry, which is Give Me an Answer at our church as well, which there's a lot of angry atheists, mainly in upstate New York. We're in New Canaan, Connecticut, who will write me emails. A radicalized Muslim called me the other day. We have our producer sometimes other provide titles on our videos and some type of infidels. The Muslim called me and over my Facebook.
There's actually
And
some people in the comments saying you're a little quiet. Could you hold the phone a little bit closer so they can hear you better?
yeah, is that better?
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Okay. So, there's a lot of good. I think it's healthy drama that goes on in Connecticut as well as upstate New York and New York City around our videos, our content. Ultimately, you can't be pastoral or a counselor on a college campus doing apologetics. That just flat out doesn't work. My very first college campus, Southern Connecticut State University, I did that, and about probably 10 people stopped by. That was it. So you have to obviously have a level of intensity as well as a level of kind of assertiveness, a desire to debate. And there's a Christian camp, not really anybody who goes to our church, but there's definitely a Christian camp out there who would disagree with apologetics altogether. They think it's prideful, it's arrogant, it's too divisive, it's not really souls, quote unquote. But I strongly for reasons. And So yeah, but it's interesting because I've had a ton of emails, more so lately than ever, probably, from just angry atheists cursing me out, calling me a lunatic. But we have an event here in Stamford at the Yacht Club in a month from now, and a lot of them said they're going to show up. So that'll be some good Q&A.
Awesome. So yeah, last time in our conversation we were talking about reasons to believe in a God, and my position is that there aren't any reasons to believe because all of the arguments and evidence used to indicate a God can be better explained by natural explanations. So could you tell me a few of the reasons that you believe there are for belief in a God?
Hmm. Yeah. So I would obviously we got to define proof because I didn't hear you say the word proof, but a lot of folks kind of probably in your similar camp would say, well, prove to me there's a God. Don't just give me the evidence. I need proof. So I would define proof. I think in our culture today, people buy into proofism, which they think that it's empirically impossible to even come close to identifying that there is a God. And secondly, proofism is that it's obvious to all that there's not a God. So that's how I would personally define. People have different definitions of proof. Um, so I go based off of simply evidence, mainly historical, because really the linchpin, everything hangs on the resurrection as the historical event, whether the Christian faith is true or not. So evidence for the resurrection, I would say, is definitely one of the biggest pieces of evidence because there is so much surrounding it, which is one of the reasons why I'm a Christian. Also, human rights. I think from a naturalistic perspective, it is very tough to ground human rights. That's connected to the moral argument. I think also more of a personal side of it is being a mental health and marriage family counselor. I've counseled at Mass General psychiatry as well as at a few different churches. And when you bring spirituality and faith into the picture, you're able to see healing in mental health, marriage and families, mental health and relationships at a way deeper level, I've personally found, than if you simply bring about secular techniques to try and get at the biggest questions of life. So what's our meaning, purpose? Why are we here? Do we have an ultimate future? Is there such a thing as love, or is it just oxytocin and the cuddle chemicals, etc.? So those are a few of them. How come you're an atheist, you would say, Tom?
Well, I'm an atheist because I think all of those things could be better explained by naturalism in a lot of ways. Like, for example, take the historicity argument. Like, I've had several historiographers on my show, like Dr. Craig Bloomberg, and we talked about why it is that most historians don't take the evidence for the resurrection to be indicative of the resurrection. And the reason is because they think that the kind of evidence that history provides isn't the kind that can justify things that don't have an empirical basis. And what I mean by that is, like, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. And the difference between those two claims is that with the dog, it has the combination of my personal testimony that I saw a dog, in addition to a bunch of implicit empirical evidence of the word dog, which entails like its genetic makeup, chemical composition, how to train dogs, what they're allergic to, their taxonomy, their phylogeny. There's tons of scientific stuff we have about dogs implicit in just using the word dog. And so that combination of my testimony plus the empirical evidence makes it reasonable to believe I saw a dog. Whereas if I said I saw a unicorn, the unicorn doesn't have any of that empirical basis. So it's only going off of my testimony. And so the testimony alone is insufficient to believe the unicorn exists outside of my imagination. And all of history is just testimony. And so the same thing, the same methodology applies to history. And so if someone in history says they saw something like a miracle or a magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, those wouldn't be reasonable to believe based off of the testimony of the history until they could actually provide that additional empirical basis that's also there for dogs. Which is why in history we accept all basic things like Lincoln was killed in a theater, or Washington was the first president, or Hannibal crossed the Rubicon. All of those things have an empirical basis because everything in that story has the empirical basis in it, just like the I saw a dog. Whereas if you, for things that don't, like miracles, magic, mythical creatures, etc., those kinds of claims in history are essentially all rejected wholesale by most of the historical community because the testimony of history isn't sufficient to justify those kinds of claims, just like it wouldn't be if I told you I saw a unicorn. The other ones you mentioned were like the moral argument. Like, I think that morality is better explained
We
without...
that one for a second.
Sure.
Okay, because I feel like you're probably a little dubious of the oral tradition when I'm talking more so eyewitness testimony. So I don't believe that simply there was a matter of phone tag and that legends evolved over time. I believe obviously the events were too close to the eyewitnesses, and many eyewitnesses were still alive. And so that's why you have 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Go check with these eyewitnesses, well over 500, who actually encountered the risen Christ. I still think I'm seeing you ushering in perhaps a presuppositional bias of naturalism, where I agree if there is no God, the idea of the miraculous, such as a resurrection, is absolutely ridiculous. But if you have a God who's all powerful and outside of space and time, then there's a reason why, as C.S. Lewis taught Shakespeare, he character in miracle, and we can believe that not of Dilettante, others who want supernatural of evidence, miraculous evidence that they say that we somehow have to prove that way. No, you talk to most historians and most scholars, most literary critics too, they would say based off of the type of writing you see, whether it's embarrassing details, so many details in scripture, it's not written as fiction, one, and it's also much more a matter of look at other ancient texts. Other ancient texts have just a total of paucity when it comes to the amount of sources and how close the events were to the actual manuscripts that were written.
Well, I
So I think
apologize
all of
just
that
to jump
together
in just
it's
for a
still
second.
accounts for better historical evidence. But if you have the presuppositional bias of naturalism, then you're right. It's kind of ridiculous.
Well, I didn't even say anything about naturalism at all. That was never a part of my argument. So my argument is just that, like, and I granted the eyewitness testimony. I can just say every single one of them is an eyewitness testimony, and it still doesn't apply for any evidence. So if I told you I saw a unicorn, that's an eyewitness statement, but they wouldn't make it reasonable to believe I saw a unicorn or that unicorns actually exist. So in history, like the vast majority of historians, to quote Mike Licona, most historians and biblical scholars hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity. So most historiographers reject the idea that miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs can ever be reasonable to believe based off of historical evidence alone, because all historical evidence is testimony. And whether it doesn't matter if it's eyewitness testimony or indirect hearsay, it doesn't make a difference. The testimony doesn't make it reasonable to believe, just like testimony today doesn't make it reasonable to believe. Like we have thousands of eyewitnesses of UFOs, tens of thousands of eyewitnesses of the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot, millions of eyewitnesses of miracles and magic, and thousands, tens of thousands of eyewitnesses of Hindu miracles, specifically of Santi Sai Baba. We have lots of eyewitness testimonies of these that are far better than that of the Old Testament or the New Testament accounts of the resurrection. But none of that is reasonable to believe that those things exist until we can actually scientifically repeatedly demonstrate these things are real and not just in our imagination. Because of the reason I explained that, like if I told you I saw a dog, that's reasonable because dogs have an empirical basis there. Whereas if I told you I saw a unicorn, that's not reasonable because unicorns don't have an empirical basis. And so history works the same way. Any claim in history is only reasonable if it has that empirical basis. And if it doesn't, then just the testimony that they said so isn't good enough to be a justified basis in believing that those things that don't have an empirical basis actually exist. And that's the consensus in the field of history. And it has nothing to do with naturalism. There's no assumption of naturalism there at all, because even if there is the supernatural, you would still need some way to differentiate, is this one account a real thing that exists in the world as a part of the supernatural, or is it just something they imagined? And until you have that methodology to differentiate between those two, it's not reasonable to believe it's real, and as opposed to just being imaginary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm kind of following there. I still think, though, you have so many Christians dying for what they would know to be a lie, which is historical resurrection, that it wouldn't have happened, that they didn't receive Jesus' body, and yet they would still die for it. Very different from like a Jones type scenario, or the Davidians, or really any other scenario I can think. The principle of those dying afterlife in or radical Muslims flying into buildings. It's still radically different because so many of those Christians would be dying for what they, again, knew to be a lie. That's where I see it as very different from, say, those who believe in aliens. If you all of a sudden had thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people dying after supposed eyewitness testimony and seeing these aliens and saying, I'm going to die for them anyway, because they're making these claims that you have to believe in me in order to have salvation, then I would have to seriously consider these aliens existing and putting my faith in them as well. But I don't see how you can usher in this type of evidence that you're asking for in order that somehow is going to either prove or disprove a religion.
Well, to take your example, like lots of people dying for what they believe. Like if we put that into a court of law and said, so we're saying, well, do the aliens exist or does the resurrection exist? Whatever we want to go with, and say this is on the table for is it innocent or guilty, and we're in a courtroom and we present this evidence that, well, a lot of people died because they believed it. Well, the court would just throw that out immediately. That has nothing to do with whether or not it's true. And the same thing of like saying, well, they were persecuted. Well, that doesn't tell us whether it's true or not. So again, that would just be thrown out of the courtroom because it's not actually evidence. For evidence to be like reasonable, you have to actually show that the thing is true, regardless of what people believe. Like whether people died for it or not, or were persecuted for it, doesn't add anything to the truth of the claim. It just makes it not obviously false. Where if someone would like lie for it, or immediately change their story under threat of death, that means it would be more likely or possibly it would be easier to believe it was a lie, but it wouldn't add any credence to it being true that they didn't. Like we know that Falun Gong people died and were persecuted for their religion all the time. Same with Hinduism and Buddhism, and Buddhists would light themselves on fire with gasoline and die for what they believed in. There are lots and lots of people who die for what they believe in, especially like cults.
Yep.
Don't drink the Kool-Aid, essentially. There
Right.
are lots of people who do
but
that. But
not for what they knew to be a lie. That's the qualifier. That's the crucial distinction right there.
Oh, right. They believed it was true.
Right. If they would have known it was a lie, so a big hoax, big cover-up, like supposedly the disciples of Christ would have been doing, then they wouldn't have died for it. You don't have thousands of people dying in that kind of way. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would not argue that they didn't believe. I believe that they were genuine believers in their faith. I don't think they were lying at all.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so you have to deal with this physical resurrection body. And the evidence I go by is, you talked about eyewitness testimony. Well, in every single account, it's the women showing up at the tomb first. That is totally counterproductive. And actually, in that day and age, a women's testimony and their account would be thrown out in court. And so why in the world, if they are trying to pull off a hoax, would have women be the first tomb discovering Christ? And then Christ shows up to Jewish people who would have way more hoops to jump through to believe in an actual physical bodily resurrection. Remember, the Jews believed that at the very end of time, there would be mass resurrection. But they also definitely didn't believe that a single savior would die on a cross. No, he was powerful, not dying on a cross. That would be the ultimate curse. And then you have these dramatic life changes. So James, brother of Jesus, who lived with Jesus, used the same toilet growing up, denied him entire life. And then you have all of a sudden the resurrection occurs, and you have people like James, Paul, these radical life changes, documentation of, and tradition external. The tradition is James started as really the head of the early church, started to incredible claims, and he was thrown off the balcony of a tall temple, and then really smashed to death at the bottom because he was still making these claims. So something changed, snapped within these disciples and these people later on to say, okay, wow, I really need to make even a major paradigm shift. And we think of Aristotelian paradigm shifts at that kind of level if I'm really going to say that this man rose from the dead. So something happened. And then lastly, the rise of the early church. I think from a naturalistic perspective, you truly can't explain it. I think the percentage of people in the Roman Empire, how the Christian faith took over the Roman Empire, well before Constantine. This is not Dan Brown. We can't fall down in the whole Dan Brown trap, who in the very beginning of his book starts out saying all these things really happened. And I had many friends who bought into that lie. Some of them actually became atheists because of the Da Vinci Code, which is hilarious. And fortunately, they did come back to the faith. But they bought into this whole Dan Brown thinking that somehow this whole thing was a hoax. And yet, how do you explain this hoax with the incredible explosion before Constantine in 300, 325 AD. It just makes no sense. And I've never heard a naturalist be able to give a good reason for how the early church gained so much traction so quickly.
Well, I'd say it's exactly like how Falun Gong did, because Falun Gong grew, I think, 4 to 5 times faster than Christianity. Mormonism actually grew at the same rate, approximately. There are many different ideologies in the world that grew equally or faster in their time period. I think the fastest growing right now is non-religious, which I think is actually growing faster than Christianity was
Wait,
at
wait,
the
you're missing a
time.
key part in there, though, Tom. Social reputation, losing property, losing family members, and dying for their beliefs. My Mormon friends, I have people becoming Mormons around here. One person recently told me he was becoming a Mormon because they really take care of their own and he can get a leg up in our society because of it. It's the exact opposite of why people were becoming Christian back in that day and age.
But again, like Falun Gong is persecuted in China religiously, essentially. So, and again, more people are converting to that than any other religious demographic or belief system or whatever. So that
I'd
same,
have to look into Falun Gong.
yeah,
I've never heard of Falun Gong.
it's one in China. It's really interesting, and the Chinese government is persecuting it because it's anti their cultural history or whatever, or something like that. But yeah, so there's lots of examples of ideologies being growing in societies where it's clearly persecuted and getting people killed, but they grow anyway. I mean, that's a pretty common feature of humanity. So I don't see anything in that would be remarkable. And even if it was remarkable, that's still not evidence. The fact that a lot of people chose to turn to one ideology isn't evidence it's true. It's just evidence they believed it. And the fact that they believe it wouldn't be admissible in a court of law. You say, well, a lot of people believe that Jesus rose from the dead, or a lot of people believe that they were abducted by aliens. The judge is going to be like, okay, that's just hearsay. That isn't actually evidence of aliens. So do you have any actual evidence? So all the things you listed and all the things that I hear a lot from theists about the resurrection aren't admissible as evidence in a court of law. They're just saying, well, lots of people believed, they were persecuted, they died for what they believed. I mean, I'm happy to agree that they genuinely believe.
What
That's
would be
totally
admissible
fine. What?
in a court of law? What would be good enough in a court of law if that evidence
Um,
of water?
a demonstration of some kind of a miracle. So, like, if you can say, I believe the supernatural exists, or I believe a God exists, and we can, if a God or the supernatural exists, we can do this test and get this result. Like, if I pray to God, that just to pick a random thing, if I pray to Yahweh to give me a gold brick and a gold brick appears in front of me, that would be good evidence of the supernatural or a God, just to pick one thing. Any novel testable
Yeah.
prediction would work.
So that line of thinking was popular in the 60s and 70s, and then it kind of took a break, and now it's making a big comeback through Dillahunty and others. But I think that's really just kind of a catch-all, and I don't know if that really works because, why do you need that type of evidence, for example? Why can't it be if someone dies and then if someone is born, again, that's not a supernatural death and resurrection, but you still need a level of evidence to prove, okay, someone really died or someone is really born and exists versus a level of historical testimony, which works as well. And William Lane Craig makes this point, and he's pretty certain on it. And I haven't heard again. I just don't know where you have to get to that point of reasoning and that type of evidence. But say if we even get there, near-death experiences is becoming greater and greater today in terms of the amount of evidence we have for them. Over 30 million people in India and Europe alone have claimed near-death experiences. And then I think I mentioned this to you last time, over 300 peer-reviewed articles coming out of Duke University now talking about these actual experiences and doctors saying, yes, these supernatural experiences have happened. And I've always thought near-death experiences were kind of a joke and I would never use them in a debate. But there's been such a great increase that the strongest naturalists are having a tough time talking about what is really going on there.
Well, I'm actually pretty familiar with the NDE research, and well, to go back to your original point, the historicity again, I don't think that we don't need. When you say why do we need that kind of evidence? Well, we need some way, no matter what epistemology we use, the first thing you need is a way to differentiate between is X imaginary, or is X a real part of the world? Like, the way knowledge starts is I think, therefore I am. So that's the first thing we can all know, absolutely. And then there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. If I'm imagining a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn in front of me. There's some difference between these two things. And so we need some kind of a methodology to differentiate. Is this thing that we claim exists one of the imaginary things, or is it one of the real things? Now, the way I know that we reliably can do that is with science, future testable predictions. Like anybody can explain anything post hoc after it happens. So if you say like a cup falls over, like what caused it to happen? Well, it could have been caused by a mouse, or it could have been caused by a bird or a squirrel or a leprechaun or a magic space aliens or a meteorite. You can explain how the cup fell over in infinitely many ways. And all of those explanations can explain all the evidence we know. So like if we see mouse droppings around the cup and you said like space aliens knocked over the cup, you could say, well, there was a mouse there and it left the droppings and then walked away, but it didn't knock over the cup. That was the space aliens. So anybody can always explain the past evidence. But what makes the future testable predictions the best kind is that if you have an explanation that can say, if my theory is correct, I can predict into the future we're going to discover this thing which we don't know yet, and you get it right consistently, then that's good evidence that that explanation you have is mapping onto the world and isn't just something in your imagination like the space aliens. So that's why we need that kind of evidence, because it can differentiate between is this imaginary or is this real. Now, it may not be the only way. I'm not going to say this is just the only way that could ever be. Any way that you can use that can differentiate between is this imaginary, is this real, counts as evidence. I just don't know of any other reliable methodology other than empiricism at this time. And
Well, here, yeah.
the things you presented would not qualify, because believing something is true isn't evidence it's true. You can believe things are true and they're not true. So that doesn't give us a way to differentiate. The number of people doesn't give us a way to differentiate between the imaginary and the real, because it's a bandwagon. Argumentum ad populum. The fact that people were willing to die for what they believed in doesn't give us a way to differentiate, because there's people willing to die for things that are not true all the time. So none of the things you presented actually give us a way to differentiate. Well, is this a real thing or is it an imaginary thing? So that's why we need some kind of evidence that can differentiate, because we need some way to be able to tell the difference between is it imaginary or is it real. The second thing you mentioned was about near-death experiences. Near-death experiences right now, we are just at the precipice of discovering and researching NDEs, so we don't actually know what they are caused, and the brain is one of the two least understood fields in science. So that you have neurology and biology, the two most complicated, least understood fields in science. And right now, the top explanation of NDEs is that it's essentially when your brain shuts down unexpectedly. What happens is that all of the things in your brain are still operating as if you were conscious. So everything that is you're experiencing through your senses is still being saved to conscious memory. So if you have a cardiac arrest and you get knocked out, and there's a doctor there and he gives you CPR or touches you or uses like a saw or something near you, etc., all of that gets saved into your conscious memory. And when you wake up, you remember it as if you were conscious, even though you weren't. And so people can recall things like that, well, we had this experience while I was supposedly dead. Well, no, what happened was that your sensations that your brain was still functioning in some sense, your touch, sight, smell, taste, whatever, was still sending signals to your brain, which were being saved as conscious memories because your brain shut down unexpectedly, and which is why you can recall all of these things. So none of the near-death experiences seems to be evidence of the supernatural. It's just something we can't explain fully yet, but there are still the consensus in the cognitive neurosciences is still that it's just a material thing.
I'm talking more so though about the eyewitness testimony, the doctors who've been 5 rooms down the hallway and said that this man, while he was pronounced dead, was able, when he woke up, to read us 10 to 12 digit numbers off a sheet 5 rooms down the hallway. See, my naturalistic friends are totally at a loss on that one. And yet, I'm totally going to concede here. I'm not going to stand on the shaky leg of NDEs when it comes to the supernatural. But I will say this in response to your previous point. Blaise Pascal, arguably the greatest mathematician to have ever existed, Pascal's wager, he was a Christian. He did say, when it comes to that evidential piece, he said that God has given us, those of us who have open hearts, enough evidence to become Christians, and those of us who still have closed hearts, not enough evidence, and there never will be enough evidence. I think that's a fascinating point, but here's why I think it's fascinating, because it gets into how in the West we've bought into simply this type of logical, cerebral, intellectual level of evidence. And so many atheists I know will say, I'm an atheist because of logic, because of intellect, Mark Twain, As soon as reason ends, that's where faith picks up, and it's kind of a quack, a joke. Well, what so many atheists and Christians don't realize is that you go to Eastern countries, okay, faith-based positions are based way more so on the imagination, way more so on meta-narrative, way more so on a sociology of knowledge, connecting with other people, very communal. And so what I think Blaise Pascal was getting at also, you could connect it to, is all of us come to a worldview or a position based off of 3, 4, 5 different modes of acquiring knowledge. One would be the intellectual logic that you and I have been talking about. Secondly would be personal. What have been our personal experiences? So many would say that certain Christians have had personal experiences where they are more fearful of death than many atheists, and so they have this type of Freudian wish fulfillment that they want to see mom or dad in the afterlife, so they become Christians. I've also heard the argument many people make that, for example, Dr. Vates, a famous psychiatrist, wrote a book on how the top, I think, 100, 150 atheists from the last 200 years all had daddy issues, absentee fathers, fathers who passed away. So basically, it's this cosmic complex of authority issues where I'm just fighting against this idea of a father, a big guy in the sky. And so I'm not even going to look into the evidence. So there's personal issues, whether I've experienced God personally as well or not. And then there's the sociology of knowledge. Peter Berger, who spoke times in my seminary, one of the best sociologists, I think, in the past 50 years, might be biased. But he was a Christian, and he came out with that, really wrote a bunch of books on the sociology of knowledge, showing clearly that we are such socialized animals to such a degree where we don't even realize at a subconscious conscious level how much those who are around us, who we either want to be like or have a great impact on us, determine what faith position we take, whether that's atheism or theism.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. Definitely, like if my prayers were answered when I was still a Christian, then and those things happened some reasonably short period of time after I prayed, I'd still be a Christian. So I think the reason I became an atheist is fundamentally because none of my prayers were answered. And so that personal experience, I realize, is definitely a huge impact on why people believe. But my contention is that I don't think the reasonable logic thing does, in fact, give us reason to believe. Like, because I think the fundamental part of my argument is that part where I said we need some way to differentiate, is this imaginary or is this a real thing? And the best way I know to do that is science. I don't know of any other ways that can do it. There definitely could be other ways. But without that, without some kind of a way to differentiate between is this imaginary or is this real, then I don't think we can use logic or reason to get to the conclusion of a God. I definitely think personal experience is fine. I wouldn't argue against that. If you believe because your prayers were answered, I think that's perfectly reasonable. But I don't think that we have logical, reasonable, like objective kind of scientific reasons to believe until we can give some kind of way to differentiate, is this imaginary or is this real? So I agree with you. There are lots of different, it's a multifaceted approach of why people believe what they believe. But my only contention is that the reasonable, logical methodology we use has to give us a way to differentiate, is it imaginary, is it real? Otherwise, it can't justifiably indicate a God. And I don't think that the theist approach does that.
Yeah, I still think, though, the very first scientific question we have to ask has nothing to do with science. It's philosophy. You know, how did this place come into existence? I don't believe in a multiverse. I believe that there was a Big Bang. I believe that there was an actual start. I think Genesis 1:1 is the real miracle that the Bible answers, that this place did have a great beginning. And with that beginning, that's when life sprang about. And then there is entropy, starting with Genesis chapter 3, the great fall. So I think this narrative we all base our lives on, this would get to human rights. So many of our ethics are just really sit in the bed of Judeo-Christian values, which really is what started this country. Yes, it was Christians and deists. You can't just say Christians. But again, it was that religious framework that has truly set so much of what we believe to why in the world would someone have intrinsic value, no matter who they are, no matter their race, ethnicity, no matter if they have Down syndrome or other disabilities. So I think Science doesn't answer those questions, especially when it comes to ethics. And we know when science has tried to answer those questions. When it comes to ethics, think Nazi Germany.
Well, that wasn't science. There wasn't any
Here
science in that.
problem. So scientism obviously is looking wholesale at everything from a scientific level. But I see what you're saying. But I still think from the very beginning, the whole issue of if this place came about, if it did have a start, again, that is a philosophical question. Science gets at process, but philosophy gets at origin. But so that's kind of my thinking. I just wanted to address your prayer, personal side of prayer real quick. I don't know. I don't want to speak too specific to it because I don't know if you lost a loved one and you were praying for their healing or whatnot. But I had some Jewish friends who used to say, Stuart, I pray and I say, God, if you show up 5 times a day and just prove yourself to me. Every single day I pray, and I want you to show up right here, right now. That'll be supernatural evidence, and bam, I'll believe in you. Okay, would you treat a friend like that? Would you say, Tom, if you give me money 5 times a day and it helps me pay my rent, man, you're my buddy. But if you don't, I don't really want you as a friend. I think that's playing a pretty dangerous game that no one really relies on when it comes to true friendship and true trust.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think there's this real misconception of Americans' understanding of what prayer is. And I see people, so as a pastor, I've been at the bedside of those who are praying and they're dying of cancer. And most of them, fortunately, prayer has strengthened them and given them even joy and peace amidst the pain, unlike those who don't have a sense of God, an understanding of Him and trust in Him, and a vibrant prayer life. So the way it is able to help not only deal with suffering, but also grow somebody when they are suffering, I've found to be phenomenal.
Yeah, so your first point was the universe began to exist, and I agree the universe did begin to exist, or our universe did for sure. But that could also be explained by more natural phenomenon. So we know there are definitely things in the universe we can't explain, like the origin of the universe, the fine tuning, dark matter, dark energy, near-death experiences. There's lots of things we can't explain, but it seems more reasonable to infer those are going to be explained by natural causes than a god. I mean, just asserting that they could be explained by a god, I don't think would be evidence of a god, especially since we're making progress in all of those fields. Like even the origin of the universe, there's definitely models in physics where there's natural things that can exist outside of space-time, like Nima Arkani-Hamad's amplituhedron and Sean Carroll's emergent space-time and several other different models. And all of those are just combinations of physics. So the multiverse, the one you mentioned, is a combination of early universe inflation and vacuum states. And all of that is empirical science. They're just combining it in new ways. And so the fact that that's all physics that's been verified and just a combination of verified physics, even though the collection hasn't been verified, like the multiverse hasn't been verified, it's still just built on physics that we have verified. And so that seems to be far more reasonable than to add in an extra thing in the hypothesis like the supernatural
But
or
what if
God.
physics is gravity? Like, we know the effects of them, but we don't even really know what gravity is.
Well, gravity is the curvature of space-time. We do know what gravity is now, thanks to Einstein.
That must have happened like a day ago because I was listening to a recent science debate, two pretty successful scientists, and they were saying you can't even truly define what gravity is, and we probably won't be anytime soon.
Maybe they were
So
talking about
going
quantum
off,
gravity because that's definitely true. But I'm pretty sure regular gravity was described by Einstein in general special relativity as the curvature of space-time, and that seems to be the consensus among physicists as far as I know. I've had quite a few of them on my show.
so we fully understand the laws of gravity as well as exactly how it works.
Oh, we don't fully understand anything. Science doesn't ever get us to fully understanding. That's not a science
Right.
thing.
Well, that's my point. So there is a faith. You use faith in science as well. There's so many theories and hypotheses that we can't get this ironclad understanding of even gravity. And so, yes, we have a bunch of theories out there, and I think we've done wonders when it comes to understanding what gravity and these theories are. But there's still so much work to be done, and so that's it's just science, and we need to go by science and logic. We never just go by science or logic. And jumping over to human rights, for example, I think that the naturalist has, from a scientific standpoint, it is such a leap of faith to get to an understanding of human rights from the atheistic point of view. I'll say, human rights can come from, for example, one, we're all created in God's image, so you have to respect and love somebody no matter who they are. Or you could get human rights from evolution, the strong eating the weak. So the strong really should survive, and they have more value than the weak. Or you could get it from your own personal preference. You know, the 51% could decide that the 49% should be slaughtered. And so it's my own personal preference, and I get a large group of people around, and we decide who really has human rights and value. And then we destroy whoever we want to, or we uplift them and we serve them. Or I've heard other perspectives on it, saying it's just a brute fact, and we just got to deal with human rights, and we don't know how we got human rights. We don't know why we should respect people, but we should just respect them. And I think that could also be included with kind of the utilitarian perspective, where I see so many people, they go about, atheists especially, incredible people, all right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Christians are immoral in any kind of way. Incredible people, and yet it's interesting to listen to their language when it comes to serving and helping other people, even if it's writing down on a resume to get into a Harvard or something. So often they'll be appealing to their own selfish desires to get there. So I'm going to serve that nonprofit in order to get it on my resume. I see this all the time in New Canaan, Connecticut, in order to get to this level. And that's not a horrible thing, but I'm simply saying by that, if we're simply doing good things and we're going about achieving human rights or not achieving rights based off of selfish desires. And I think it makes more sense from the Christian point of view, where it's such an egalitarian perspective that everybody has innate value, and you should even disadvantage yourself for somebody who's hurting. And that doesn't make sense either from an evolutionary perspective either. Because, for example, if you're in a pack and the weakest link in the pack goes down, well, oftentimes we see in the animal kingdom, and I definitely think humans, for example, from an evolutionary perspective, the weakest person in your pack, you should let die, or your whole pack is going to be in serious trouble. It would be selfish to help that one weakling because now you're endangering the whole pack. And I heard, for example, at a couple different universities, actually, kids have brought up this whole idea of, the Roman Colosseum made sense. And they were nihilists. Some of them were, I'm sure, naturalists, I think. And their whole point was, no, it was fine to murder some of the Christians or some of those who were imprisoned or spoils of war in the Roman Colosseum, because that's how you helped the slaves. The slaves were dying of starvation. And so, obviously, from the perspective of, if you want to decrease poverty and help the economic system in the Roman Empire, you're going to allow for the gladiators to just destroy some of those who are the weaklings. And that's not selfish. There's nothing innately wrong with that. And so, again, that's why I think naturalism just doesn't stack up and just doesn't really make any sense when it comes to human rights.
Well, I wanted to bring up one thing you mentioned about prayer. So in my case, when I was praying to God, I had major depression my entire life. I didn't have any close humans and ever, no close friends or family. And I essentially was praying every day, morning and night, to find close relationships, which I never did. And so it wasn't like me asking for God to give me money in my bank account every five times a day or whatever. It was more just asking for the personal relationship that and loving relationship that you expect from reading the Bible and expecting a God to be there who's all loving and who wants to have a personal relationship with you, and not having any relationship like praying to a milk jug. If you pray to a milk jug for long enough and nothing happens, eventually you're going to realize it's just a milk jug. And that was kind of like what it was for me. In the human rights thing, I think that if
Could we just for a second?
Sure.
That's a real, because I had kind of a similar type of ordeal in my life. I didn't hear God's voice whatsoever. And I was with a woman who said she used to feel God's, and then she hit a level of depression. Didn't emotionally connect with him anymore, and so she ditched her faith. I think so often emotions are connected with faith. When emotions are depressed or very anxious, our faith decreases at the same time. And you see these biblical examples throughout. So David's being chased by Absalom to kill him. He actually has to soul talk. He's talked to himself, "Why are you downcast, O my soul?" Because he's very depressed. He's eating his tears, it says, every day and night. So clear symptoms of depression. But he speaks to his soul, "Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for all yet praise him, my Savior and my Lord." And so it's the best type of psychology, that type of self-talk, where he realizes his depression is deceiving him. He doesn't feel God's presence, and yet this is the man after God's own heart. This is like the biggest leader in the Bible, himself saying this. that depression is eating his lunch. God feels so far off. He even says that death is his greatest ally. He even tells God to take a hike. I don't even want to believe in you and have any kind of relationship. So I think to your point, I mean, I've experienced that in my life too, coming out of college, where I didn't have any experiential type of relationship with God in my prayer life. But prayer is primarily to grow in us a type of courage, strength, and connection to be more like God, and then also a type of hope to understand what our future is. But if it is a type of experience to grow in our, for example, to get out of a depression, I oftentimes will not see that work because depression can be a really complex issue. You know, there's the physical, there's the neurochemical, you got to attack it with therapy at times. Yes, there's the spiritual, there's the intellectual, and trying to think through how do I fix this thing. And so oftentimes when someone says they've just tried to pray themselves out of depression, I'll say that's probably not going to work. And God oftentimes is very distant in times of suffering, as well as in times of when our emotions are really failing us.
Right. I wasn't praying to be cured of the depression. I was praying to have close human relationships of some kind. So it was not quite the same. And after about 20 years not having anything happen of positive,
Yeah.
kind of like praying to, if you pray long enough to a milk jug and nothing happens, eventually you're going to say it's just a milk jug kind of a thing. But I did want to talk about what you said about human rights and morality. So from the atheist perspective, there isn't a grounds of objective morality. We haven't discovered it yet. We don't know what it is. Most philosophers, even though most philosophers are atheists, are moral realists. So they do believe that there are true moral facts. And we just don't have a concrete explanation of why. It's an unsolved problem in philosophy. And the reason is because like nothing works as a solution. Even if you put in a God as a solution for objective morality, it doesn't work. It doesn't solve any of the problems. Like if I give you a complicated math equation and you put equals God, well, that doesn't do anything. You actually need to solve the problem. And in morality, there's lots of those kinds of problems, like the trolley problem, the is-ought problem, the Euthyphro dilemma, the G. E. Moore's open question argument. All of these problems are real problems, like math problems that actually need to be solved. And just putting in God there doesn't actually give you a solution, just like it doesn't give you a solution to any kind of trigonometry equation. And so the reason the God explanation doesn't work in philosophy of ethics is the same reason none of the secular theories work in the philosophy of ethics, because they just don't answer the questions. But if we look at like two universes, one with God, one without a God, and someone kills another person in the universe with a God and someone kills another person in the universe without a God, both actions are equally immoral. The God there makes no difference to the morality of the action one way or the other. So the morality seems to be intrinsic into the interaction between the two people, regardless of whether or not there is a third party there to be like a ruler or a measuring stick. It doesn't make a difference to the morality of the action. So it seems that morality and what it really makes a moral statement true or not is whether it impacts, or there is some kind of an impacting action between two beings, two parties. And regardless of whether or not there's a God, the God doesn't seem to make any difference one way or the other in moral statements as far as anyone can tell. And adding a God into the equation doesn't seem to solve any of the moral problems, which is why it's not really accepted as a solution in moral philosophy. So I don't see how, in your worldview, having a God there does anything to give a stronger basis of objective morality than me just saying like it's an undiscovered law of nature or something like that. It's just, it doesn't really solve any of the problems. It's just kind of like a placeholder kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I was going more human rights, but okay, let me just touch on that real quickly. Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, that Pulitzer Prize-winning book, when she went down in Virginia to a creek bed and she was looking forward to just dealing with kind of this nice waxing and waning of nature and looking at insects and animals, and she saw insects just destroying each other. So some type of insect hopped on a frog, sucked its brains out, and talked about, okay, how do we get human rights and morality from an evolutionary perspective? Nature, raised red in tooth and claw, is out just to kill itself. It's kill or be killed. And there's just violence. So either Mother Nature is just a monstrosity, or I need a lobotomy, she said. And so we just don't get human rights and morality from the animal kingdom. It makes zero sense. And that was one of the things that led her to her Christian faith. But more pointedly to your point, I like that you went with the oughts and the shoulds because I agree where you don't need that third moral agent to see whether something is innately moral or not. I fully agree with that. I have no problem. But I still think all of our language, when it comes to is and oughts, points to some transcendent moral lawgiver. It's not the Christian God, but a God. And two examples, Dostoevsky is my favorite writer outside of C.S. Lewis. And when Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, goes about killing that woman who had her niece enslaved, and she was just a nasty woman, and she had a bunch of money that she was just sitting on. And he got to the point of saying, there's no oughts, there's no shoulds, there's no ultimate transcendent moral order. So why in the world is it totally wrong if I get away with this to kill this woman? He kills the woman, he's on the run, and then what happens? Natural theology happens, which is we see the clear order in the universe that leads us to God, and also our inner moral conscience leads us to God. We have an idea of what's right and wrong truly inside of us. And Raskolnikov, if you read it, sinks into tremendous mental illness, depression. I mean, he becomes suicidal, and the only way to really get out of his just own inner policeman is to turn himself in order to become mentally healthy. He just wants mental health at that point because he sees, okay, there absolutely is an ought, a should, a right or wrong. That's more than just a preference, more than just a feeling. And Dostoevsky plays this out in most of his novels. If you think about Brothers K too, Ivan and Alyosha. Alyosha's the dumber one. Ivan's the atheist. But Ivan himself, if you look at Crime and Punishment, Ivan just can't line up this whole premise and conclusion type thing. And Alyosha does, in an understanding of, okay, I can't live out why I should truly live this way. And that's why I think Dostoevsky is connected to Nietzsche in different ways, because Nietzsche said in a lot of those certain situations where you see human rights played out, and Ivan trying to be a good guy at times, it's just atheists stealing from Christians, because the Christian understanding is not the evolutionary approach when it comes to morality. Instead, there's a real reason to act rightly all the time, as opposed to it just being totally arbitrary. So that's kind of, again, it's the whole what's your premise and what's your conclusion based off of it. And I don't think these are proofs for God's existence by any stretch of the imagination. And yet I think they are big jumps that naturalists have to take that there's really no explanation of other than just it's a leap in the dark.
Well, I disagree with that. So I'm familiar with the brothers Kamarov and the Crime and Punishment, and where he kills the landlord. But that isn't evidence of a god in any way, because you've just essentially asserted that a god can act as
Morality.
the objective grounds, or yeah, morality or human rights or whichever version of oughts
Oh,
you want to go for.
yeah.
But a god again doesn't solve any of the philosophical questions of what is the grounds here. So God is essentially just a subject, and he's saying, so this is my nature, this is my perspective on what morality is, which is no different from like a person saying this is my nature, this is my perspective. It doesn't give us an objective grounds of morality, it gives us a subjective grounds of morality because it's contingent on a god. For an objective grounds of morality, it can't be contingent. If it's contingent, then it's subjective. So when we're talking about morality, for it to be objective, it has to be independent of anything, including a god, which is why if you take the two universes, one where someone killed, one with a god, one without a god, and in both universes someone kills someone else, the action is equally as moral or immoral in both worlds. It doesn't make a difference one way or the other whether the god is there. And that's why in moral realism and moral philosophy and ethics, it's not grounded in evolution. Evolution isn't what the objective grounds of morality is. Evolution is just epistemic means of knowing morality.
So how do you get morality?
Well, there's lots of different theories about that. There's tons of them,
What
but
about
it's
you,
an
Tom?
unsolved problem. There's like
Have you,
my view is more like the Kantian view. It's a synthetic a priori. It's like an idealistic perfect triangle. Perfect triangles don't exist. There are no perfect triangles anywhere in the universe, but we can use our thought processes a priori to discover the system by which we can understand a perfect triangle, and then we can use that idea to get as close as possible into this world to the perfect triangle, even though there is no such thing as a perfect triangle. If you try to draw a perfect triangle, you zoom in on the electrons, they're all bubble shaped. It's impossible to get a perfectly straight line, so it's impossible to draw a perfectly straight triangle. But we can still use the abstract a priori idea of a perfect triangle to guide our actions and make them obligatory to this is what will get us closer to a perfect triangle, this is what will get us further away from a perfect triangle. And morality applies the same way. we can use the abstract idea of the best of all possible worlds, to steal Leibniz's term, and we can use that as a grounds to determine what is morally good and morally bad. So if this essentially, the best of all possible worlds is one where all interactions are voluntary, consensual. If it's not consensual and you force someone to do it, it's immoral, essentially. And that ideal is where I ground objective morality. I say that the best of all possible worlds is a world where all interactions are consensual, and that is the objective grounds of morality, the perfect triangle. And then we can use that abstract ideal and to try and guide our actions in this world to try and get as close as possible. So we can ground it in that way without a God completely, just like we can ground the idea of a perfect triangle purely with mathematics.
So an example of an older man having sex with a woman under the age of 18, that would not be consensual because she's under 18. She doesn't have the ability to
Right.
decide whether it's consensual or not.
Right.
Okay, I just want to. Okay, but I don't know how you would get to the perspective, though, of consensual universally when it comes to just culturally conditioned laws. I can see it again from a transcendent moral order, and I don't know about your contingency argument. I see where you're going with it, but I believe that there is truly an evil and a good. I know that you do not believe in evil. It's impossible to believe in evil if you're a naturalist.
Well, wait.
And
Well, I mean, I would say evil is the same as immorality. So I would use those terms synonymously, and I'd say if you do something that moves us away from the best of all possible worlds, that is evil or immoral. Just like if you draw a wiggle on a triangle, it would be less of a triangle because it's less straight.
Okay. Yeah, I would use, so all the naturalists I've had conversations with wouldn't use the word evil. They would use that secondary one you went with. But I usually, evil is considered a very religious term, and they think you're ushering in religious values by using the word evil. I have a close buddy. Long story short, I didn't want to see it, but I saw Adam Lanza's journal. It was like over 500 pages, the shooter of Sandy Hook, and I know both of the psychologists who've been interviewed on it, and one's kind of a Christian, one's not a Christian, and they both said it's unexplainable from this naturalistic perspective, where there is no evil. It's actually, if you look into the Sandy Hook case, it's impossible not to say that there's some type of religious terminology that you have to use when it comes to this is way beyond just good or bad. This is sadistic. There's some type of evil here. And so they were pointing to a satanic type of existence, which I found to be really interesting. Again, I don't think that's proof for God or anything, but it was a direction that I think a lot of naturalists have to struggle with when it comes to, okay, is there something more than just my own subjective understanding of what's good and bad? Is there real evil and real good out there? And I think if we have a God who would be the very definition and the creator at the same time of good and evil, not to go Euthyphro on you, but then that would make a lot of sense for us to know that there's a law above the law, like Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, that's outside of simply cultural conditioning. And so the most recent example of this that I know of is Nicholas Walterstorff, writing for the New York Times, atheist, naturalist, went over to Africa, the Sudan, and talked about the honor killings. If your young son or young daughter had a sexual relationship that was inappropriate, you are supposed to kill them for the sake of the family, and it's looked upon as a very good thing because it's restoring respect to the family. So why wouldn't you kill your daughter or your son who did this? There's also female circumcision going on for religious purposes, also looked at as a very good thing, very painful, but a good thing. And Walterstorff, as well as a couple others, were there and said it's impossible to usher in our type of from our socialized position in terms of our own culture to say this is truly wrong and try and convince them that this is horrible. That's not horrible. There has to be, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, because the racist whites during the civil rights era were making the same exact argument as the Sudanese. Because the Sudanese were saying, get out of here with your white Western morality. The exact same thing Martin Luther King Jr. was dealing with. That's why he wrote Letters to a Birmingham Jail, where he clearly says there's this law above the law. And I think we all gravitate towards that. It's more than just this consensual piece of language, which you're talking about. No, we know innately whether something is right or wrong, good or evil, and it's above simply the definition that the culture makes.
Well, I totally agree. So I think I'm a moral realist, so I believe there is an objective morality, and I think that we can discover that through consent. So I think consent is the description of what that objective morality is. And in those Sudanese would also reject Christian morality, and they have, where Christians have come in and tried to convert them, and they said, get out of here with your Christian morality for the same reasons. So I I also agree that there is a law above the law, but I don't think it's grounded in a
But what's
being.
morality?
What?
But what are you referring to there? Get out of here with your Christian morality. What does that mean? Are you talking about kind of the imperialism that went on with the missionaries? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, like the Sudanese and many people across the world have rejected the Christian idea of morality and adopted their own ideas of morality from different sources, like other religious beliefs or other social constructions or whatever. And so, just like they say, get out of here with your secular morality or whatever, they also say the same thing with Christian morality. It's not like having a Christian God who where you believe that there's a law above the law makes it any more compelling to them. They don't care. It doesn't makes no difference at all. So if I can come in with the same thing and say there is a secular law above the law, which is the best of all possible worlds, and they would equally not care. So having some kind of an objective grounds for morality isn't any more compelling than not. It's just having a social construction because it's more subjective about what the people believe, regardless of whether or not you claim to have a grounds that is objective or not. They don't really care. I mean, they reject science. There's lots of places in the world that reject scientific discoveries, even though they're objectively, demonstrably true, just because they're socially conditioned to not accept certain other cultures or other methodologies. So the fact that you have an objective grounds of morality doesn't make it any more compelling to different groups of people at all. It doesn't make a difference. But so again, we can still have that law above the law without a God. The God doesn't help you in that way. It doesn't make it any more or less reasonable or solve any more or less of the philosophical problems. So I don't see how that would make your worldview any more reasonable or more coherent than the atheistic interpretation, where we can add
But
in things.
how do you handle when obviously the Nazi generals were just saying we were following orders, an understanding of objective morality? I mean, they said it was just right or wrong based off of the power, the Nietzschean power that was going on. Whoever was in power, that was right or wrong at the time. I mean, who's to say that they were really wrong? Because again, the same language was used in that courtroom, that there's a law above the law. Like I don't understand why has this language always been used in all these different circumstances, but it's just supposedly you think it's just the Christian ushering in of some morality that level.
I'm not
Because
sure
I'm
what you.
talking about transcendent morality. I'm not talking about Sermon on the Mount at this point right now.
Well, I think that many people have come up with objective models of morality prior to even Christianity. That's not something unique to Christianity, and many people did it even in like
Hmm?
the
Right. Golden rule absolutely has been. Yep.
yeah, the Hinduism came up with the golden rule, I think, originally. So, but my point there was that the law above the law thing can be grounded in any lots of different things. It doesn't. You don't need a god for that. I agree there is an objective morality. I agree there is a law above the law. That's because I'm a moral realist. That's my position. But you don't need a god for that. Like I agree there is a beginning of the universe, but you don't need a god for that. And I think that the naturalistic explanations offer a better grounds than a god because it actually gives a more coherent basis of objective morality. Like in the cases you gave of like honor killings, I can say that's objectively wrong because you are doing something, you are imposing involuntary restrictions on the will of the person who you are killing. They do not consent to this. You are breaking their consent, which makes it like moving us objectively further away from the best of all possible worlds. Like I can objectively say if you draw a gigantic curve on the side of your triangle, that's not a triangle. For it to be a perfect triangle, it needs to be perfectly straight. And so you're drawing the big curve makes it objectively further away from a triangle. So I can say that if you do honor killings and kill the child without their consent, when they're children, they can't consent anyway, then that's objectively immoral because you're moving us further away from the best of all possible worlds. I can say to the Nazis, if you're killing Jews or anybody, then that's objectively immoral because you're moving us further away from the best of all possible worlds. And I can do it in the exact same way I can say, if you draw a curve on a triangle, you're objectively not making a triangle because for it to be a triangle, it needs perfectly straight lines.
Yeah, and the naturalist Peter Singer would say about those who are slowly dying of Parkinson's and other types of diseases, it shouldn't really be, especially Alzheimer's, he says. Alzheimer's, you shouldn't consider them persons because they can't consent. And so it should be the doctor's call whether to kill them or not. So it's not just Peter Singer saying this. This is becoming more and more widespread. That's why there's a 30% decrease in those with Down syndrome, for example, because they are being aborted faster than any other type of human being. And so there's no an ability for many Alzheimer's patients to have a level of consent. And Singer would say that's why we shouldn't count them as persons. Shouldn't count them as we should take away strip their personhood and go ahead and make the call whether we should euthanize them or not.
Right, and that's because he's making a pragmatic argument, not an objective moral argument. So I would say that all life, anything with consciousness, should be given consent, should have the right to determine their own lifestyle, essentially. So I think it's immoral to impose involuntary restrictions on people, anything with consciousness. So I would apply this to animals and bugs if they have consciousness, whatever. Anything that has consciousness, it's immoral to harm that thing. So I would go further than Peter Singer in that sense, and I'd say that every conscious thing has a moral value to it.
So if you're not conscious and you're hooked up to a machine, it shouldn't be. How do you view that?
If you're, I mean, like you'd be dead. Like by not conscious, I mean dead.
Right. So you're not saying reasoning capabilities.
Right.
You're saying consciousness.
Right. So that's why I said I included this like bugs and animals and stuff.
Right. Exactly. Okay, I would say, back to your original point on cultures and universalizing a worldview, especially when it comes to human rights and morality. I would disagree on your earlier point when it came to Christians and how Christians just force their morality on people. Again, it's not the morality, objective morality that I'm talking about is just from the level of it's God. It could be a Hindu God, it could be Allah, could be anyone. I will say this, though. The Christian faith travels better than any other faith, hands down. You look at it percentage-wise, for example. I mean, it's vastly moving towards 25% of the Christian faith is now in China. 17%, I think, is in South Korea. Another 25% is in Latin America. And so, to watch it to really chart it and see how it's moved away from Europe, now into the U.S., but now even greater in Latin America, Asia, big presence, and China is going to be the biggest presence by 2050. You look at all the other major world religions, and pretty much the hub is still where they started. And it's the same for the religious nons in many ways. It's always been just a Western white worldview. You look at the humanistic conferences that have gone on. The last 25 all have either been in Europe or the U.S., save one that was in Dubai, because they were like, oh, shoot, wow, maybe we should do something here. This is becoming a little too obvious that this is just a white Western worldview. So I think, Lamin Sanneh at Yale, for example, and a few other professors have spoken to this, where there's not a type of imperialism that you've seen with naturalism and humanism when you've taken those type of values and gone to Africa, which automatically strip away the miraculous, right, and the spiritual and demons. So Lamin Sanneh at Yale would say that when he saw humanistic, naturalistic values come over to Africa, that was way more imperialistic because it was basically saying to all these African tribes, it's laughable that you actually believe in the spiritual, in the demonic, in angels, for example. But then the Christian faith came over and it accepted and actually uplifted this understanding of the spiritual, the angels, the demons, and it also lifted up their Africanness. It didn't say, like a naturalist or a Westerner, you have to become white and buy into our own type of human rights understanding, but instead talked about how you keep your culture, you keep your understanding of who you are, because that comes directly out of Galatians 3:28. There's neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew. Everyone is it's the most egalitarian worldview possible. And so I think it's really interesting that you brought up that point because I've seen the opposite.
Which point were you referring to? Because my point was just that when you bring Christianity into other cultures reject the Christian worldview, just like they would reject the humanist worldview, regardless of whether or not you have an objective morality.
Yeah, I'm talking more so your consensual point. When you're talking about this consensual morality and human rights, it sounds like you're almost coming from a Western humanistic perspective, because naturalism and the religious nons, you can group them all together in a way. How is that going to your basis for morality and the consensual understanding of things? I don't know how that's going to spread to a place like Africa and do too well.
Oh, well, I mean, this is my own view of morality. I wrote a model of morality, so it's not spread anywhere yet. But yeah, I mean, it definitely could spread. I mean, there's definitely people from across the world who watch my channel and who give give responses. There are people from Africa who have watched my channel and given responses that is a positive moral view that they take seriously. So um, it definitely could spread. I haven't really tried to any proselytizing yet, so I think that was one of the reasons why Christianity spread so fast is because proselytization is such a big part of it, as opposed to Judaism, which has essentially no proselytization, and Islam the same thing. Religions that have a aspect to them where they are dictated to proselytize usually spread faster. But I would say that right now, even in more religious countries, secularism is growing a lot faster than even Christianity. Secularism is essentially the fastest growing religious denomination anywhere in the world, and not just in Western cultures, in non-Western cultures as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I haven't heard of those stats. Worldwide, in the next 10 years, secularism, atheism specifically, is going to decrease from 16% down to 12%. Religious nons, you're right, are increasing in the U.S. Christianity is not specifically decreasing. It depends on how you define Christianity, because it's the spiritual versus the non-religious types. There are many spiritual people who don't go to church who are still Christians, though. So vibrant Christianity is still, in my perspective, and this Washington Post article I saw, is still growing. But I think you have kind of the mushy middle, the cultural Christians, dying off in a way, and then religious nons are definitely increasing. But people hear religious nons and they automatically think, oh, atheism is growing. But that's not the case, because those religious nons are a lot of Christians and people of other faiths who are simply saying, we don't want to say that we're religious at this time. Instead, we're more spiritual.
Well, right. Many of them are believe in the supernatural and things as well, but I'd still
Yeah.
classify those as if they don't
But
specifically adhere to like Christianity or don't believe in
right.
Jesus, and they just believe like there is some mythical thing out there that we don't understand. There are many atheists who hold that position. I mean, I kind of hold that position too.
But I think it's really interesting because a recent study showed that the majority of people in the U.S., I can't speak for other countries, in the U.S. are coming to faith not because they were born into it, but because they're having these kind of discussions like you and I are having right now, based off of evidential claims. I think that that's really interesting. And to your point, I would agree. A lot of proselytizing. I think if you look at religions in general, you're going to have way bigger families than atheists. Atheists on average have one kid, if that, maybe even. And for religious people, it's 3 plus. But I think it's fascinating if you look at empirical studies. There's a large and larger group of people who are Muslims coming to the faith through a very spiritualized way that I was very skeptical at first, because I'm naturalistic in some ways myself. Very skeptical of certain stuff like this, but they're coming through dreams of interacting actually with Jesus. And so these dreams are so strong, and I'm not talking this is just like 100 people or 200 people. I'm talking thousands of Muslims. And I also know this not just from the studies, but I went to school with ex-Muslims at seminary who went back to their Muslim hometowns and obviously endangered their own lives by doing so. And so that one's pretty inexplainable, because you're automatically, by saying, I had this encounter with Jesus in a dream, I'm no longer a Muslim, I'm going to take off. Literally, your family's going to turn you into the government, and you're either going to be imprisoned or killed. And that's been the case for many, many people, obviously. And so it's not just this easy one-to-one correlation that it's a level of proselytizing, and these poor people they can't figure out, what's up from down. Instead, it is in the U.S. truly people are thinking through these issues, and they're thinking themselves into the faith. And in Muslim countries, thousands and thousands are coming to know Christ based off of actual dreams where they encounter him.
Well, I would still kind of attribute that to proselytization, because if you are exposed to an idea, even if you aren't essentially converted as soon as you hear it, it plants the seed kind of thing. And eventually, if you think about it more and more and more, it can grow. And that would definitely cause you to have dreams of whatever it is you were thinking about. Like if you,
No, some of these people have not even heard the gospel before.
that would be
But wouldn't you
impressive
say,
if you,
but let's stay on that line of thinking. We all proselytize. I mean, you have a channel. You're proselytizing right now.
right. But I don't like go around traveling the world to proselytize.
You're traveling the world with a channel right now. You said it's exposed to other countries.
right. But I'm not like deliberately going there to try and proselytize. I'm just posting stuff on my YouTube channel. Like
Doing it to another. Yep.
it's not like part of my ideology that I must go to this other country and then teach people of the way of the TJump.
You're right. I don't think you have that moral obligation. I think Christians do have that moral obligation. I mean, the Dartmouth Atheistic Association, Student Association, I love that they put out that article where they talked about if you're a Christian, you have a moral obligation. You better get out there and start sharing your own faith if you truly think it's how people get to the afterlife. And so I respect them for that. And it is interesting, though. You're a really, really nice, humble atheist. And I typically don't have very cordial conversations with people of your type. And I'm not making a general statement here at all. But I think I understand a lot of those angry atheists that I talk to who will drop a lot of expletives. I understand a lot of their anger comes from because they were raised in religiously fundamentalist homes. I get that. And yet, to your point, I don't know a lot of them why they proselytize. I think the new atheists are proselytizing in their own kind of way, where they're writing these intense, inflammatory books because they actually think that religion is dangerous, really, really dangerous. And I think that's a very Nietzschean approach. And I think that many fundamentalist Christians do it too. And that Nietzschean approach is let's just shout the other one down, treat them less than. And it's kind of nonsensical. And it kind of gets back to our earlier conversation on human rights and when it comes to our political sphere. This secular philosopher, Sherowitz, recently wrote this book talking about how, Matthew 5:44, right, or this Sermon on the Mount, the only way we're going to be able to fix our political situation, identity politics, and how we scream the other person down is if we start taking Matthew 5:44 seriously. And this is a secular atheist, pretty smart dude, saying this, where it's turn the other cheek, love your very enemy, and by doing that, that will completely reverse what we have going on in our country in terms of the vitriol. But it's too many Christians who don't take that to heart, instead live hypocritical lives. And way too many atheists, too, who don't take, whether it's their humanistic values or whatever they abide by, to heart either.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the most important thing we can do is have discussions with people on the other side of the issue. Though instead of the Bible, I would be quoting John Stuart Mill, that it is imperative to all human morality and understanding that if distance to all commonly held truths do not exist, we must invent them and impart unto them the strongest possible arguments a devil's advocate may conjure up, because if you only know your own side of the issue, you know little of that. So that would be my Bible quote from John Stuart Mill. But yeah, so I think that having these kinds of conversations with people on the other side and really talking about the differences in what we believe in is probably the most important thing we can do. And I think it's really sad that there isn't as much engagement between atheists and Christians. And I think that we should definitely have more and work together and have like joint conferences or whatever. That would be really cool. Instead of just having just go to our own little bubble and just talk to the people who all agree with us.
No, it's so true. That's a great point. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, well, we've been going for a little bit over an hour now. I think I should let you go.
Oh, yeah. Just to finish on that, I think in our politically correct culture, that's a serious concern of mine, because when we're debating on college campuses, Christians and atheists come out and they will try and censor us on a regular basis. And the whole crowd, fortunately, will get very upset with them because it's a dialogue that they're trying to shut down. Because if I disagree with you, it's like I am demeaning you as a person. I mean, that's scary that our country is heading in that direction.
Yeah.
I recently heard this little mantra by some college students saying, we need to be able to agree with each other on everything before we start a discussion. That's exactly it right there. And that is not respecting or loving another person. If anything, it's going the opposite direction, because I'm not going to be able to find out who the real Tom is unless I'm able to question him or disagree with some of his ideas.
Right. That's more like because I don't attribute communism and socialism. I think those are independent from atheism, but I think that the ideologies proposed in those were essentially give you a handbook. You have to become the ideology in this handbook, so everyone agrees, and then you can have conversations.
That's exactly right. So true.
Anyway, it's been great talking with you. I really enjoyed it. I'd love for you guys, you and your dad, to come down to Minnesota, come to our university campus sometime. We can chat. That'd be awesome.
Would be a blast, Tom. We'd love it.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right. Take care.
Bye.